You are driving a car that costs more than my house, and you expect me to believe it belongs to you, the officer said, his voice sharp with disbelief. The red and blue lights painted the quiet street in restless waves of color as a deep black Rolls-Royce sedan idled along the curb. The engine hummed softly like it did not belong in a place like this narrow downtown avenue lined with old brick storefronts and flickering street lamps. Behind the wheel sat Elias Brooks, a tall, calm black man in a charcoal suit whose hands rested loosely on the steering wheel. He had pulled over the moment the police lights appeared behind him. The night air carried the distant sound of traffic from the highway and the faint smell of rain drifting in from the river a few blocks away. Officer Grant Miller stepped closer, his boots scraping against the pavement as he leaned slightly toward the driver's side window, studying the man inside with narrowed eyes. The polished hood of the luxury car reflected the flashing lights like liquid fire. Elias lowered the window, slowly, the cool air brushing his face. His expression remained steady, calm, almost patient, as if this moment had already happened many times before. Officer Miller looked at the interior of the car, the hand-stitched leather, the smooth dashboard, the quiet confidence of wealth surrounding the driver. None of it matched the story the officer had already built in his mind. He folded his arms and tilted his head. "Where did you get a car like this?" he asked, the question hanging heavy in the night air. Elias met his gaze without raising his voice. "I bought it," he replied simply. The officer let out a short, dry laugh that echoed down the empty street. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. Officer Miller tapped his flashlight lightly against the door frame as another patrol car rolled slowly past at the far end of the block, its headlights sweeping across the storefront windows. He was still staring at Elias with a look that mixed suspicion with quiet judgment. "All right, sir," he said finally, his tone carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "I need to see your license and registration." Elias reached calmly toward the center console, retrieving a slim leather wallet and a folded document from the glove compartment. He handed them through the open window without a single hurried movement. The officer took the papers, glancing once more at the man behind the wheel as if waiting for some sign of nervousness. But Elias Brooks only sat there quietly, the soft glow of the dashboard lights reflecting in his eyes while the night around them seemed to hold its breath. The officer opened the registration, slowly, the paper rustling between his fingers. What he expected to find and what he was about to see were two very different things, and the next few moments were about to change the way this quiet street would remember this night. Officer Grant Miller held the folded registration between his fingers for a moment longer before opening it fully beneath the beam of his flashlight. The thin white paper glowed under the harsh light while the quiet street remained frozen under the slow pulse of red and blue police lights. Elias Brooks sat calmly behind the wheel of the black Rolls-Royce, the engine still humming with a low, confident vibration that seemed to fill the silence around them. The officer lowered his eyes to the first line of the document. His expression remained firm at first, the kind of expression worn by someone who believed the outcome of a situation had already been decided. He expected a borrowed name. He expected a company lease. He expected a story that would explain why a man like this was sitting inside a car like this. Instead, the first line read vehicle owner Elias Jonathan Brooks. The officer blinked once as if the letters might rearrange themselves if he stared long enough. The beam of the flashlight shifted slightly as his grip tightened on the paper. He glanced up toward Elias, then back down again, slowly reading the line a second time. The name did not change. The officer cleared his throat and continued scanning the document. The address listed on the registration was located only a few miles away in the northern hills of the city, a neighborhood known for quiet estates and private security gates. That detail alone caused a faint crease to appear between his eyebrows. He lowered the flashlight for a second, looking again at the man seated behind the wheel. Elias. Brooks remained exactly as he had been moments before, calm, composed, and patient. His hands rested loosely near the steering wheel while the soft glow of the dashboard lights illuminated the edges of his suit. Nothing about his posture suggested fear or urgency. The officer lifted the flashlight again, returning his attention to the registration. The vehicle identification number matched the one etched along the edge of the windshield. The make and model were correct. Everything about the document appeared perfectly legitimate. Still, Officer Miller did not close the paper. Years of experience had taught him that appearances could hide complicated stories. He stepped slightly away from the driver's side window, pressing the small radio microphone attached to his shoulder. "Dispatch, this is Miller," he said slowly, his voice steady, while his eyes remained fixed on the paper in his hand. "Requesting confirmation on vehicle registration for a black Rolls-Royce sedan registered to Elias Jonathan Brooks." The radio crackled softly with static before the distant voice of the dispatcher responded. "Copy that, Officer Miller, stand by for verification." The few seconds that followed stretched longer than expected. A cold breeze moved down the street, carrying loose newspaper pages along the sidewalk, while the police lights continued to wash the buildings in restless color. Inside the car, Elias Brooks waited without speaking. His breathing remained slow, and even as if the moment held no tension at all. Officer Miller shifted his weight from one foot to the other, still studying the document in his hand. His earlier confidence had begun to fade, replaced by a quiet uncertainty he had not expected to feel tonight. Finally, the radio came alive again. Officer Miller Dispatch confirmed, the voice said clearly. "Vehicle registration is valid. Owner listed as Elias Jonathan Brooks. No report of theft or violation." The officer stared forward for a long silent moment after the message ended. The name still rested on the paper between his fingers, but now the weight of that name felt different. He looked once more toward the man in the driver's seat, noticing details he had overlooked earlier, the precision of the suit, the calm steadiness in his eyes, and the quiet confidence that did not come from borrowed things. Officer Miller folded the registration slowly, though the question forming in his mind refused to disappear. If the car truly belonged to Elias Brooks, then there is only one explanation left to consider, and it was the one he had dismissed the moment the traffic stop began. Officer Grant Miller stood beside the driver's side door with the folded registration still in his hand, while the flashing lights from his patrol car continued to sweep across the empty street. The dispatcher confirmation echoed quietly in his mind, vehicle registration valid, owner listed as Elias Jonathan Brooks. The officer looked again toward the man sitting calmly behind the wheel of the black Rolls-Royce. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The engine hummed softly beneath the hood, and the faint glow from the dashboard illuminated Elias Brooks' face with a calm, steady light. Officer Miller shifted his stance slowly as the earlier certainty he carried at the beginning of the stop continued to fade. He had approached the vehicle, expecting to uncover something simple, a stolen car, an unpaid ticket, perhaps a driver who would become nervous under questioning. Instead, he now stood holding proof that the luxury vehicle belonged exactly to the man sitting behind the wheel. Yet something inside him resisted accepting the answer so quickly. Years of routine had trained his instincts to question what seemed unusual, and tonight everything about the scene had struck him as unusual the moment he saw the car and the driver together beneath the streetlights. Officer Miller unfolded the registration again, studying the name printed across the top, as if the paper might reveal another explanation. Elias Jonathan Brooks. The officer glanced toward the quiet buildings lining the street, and then back at Elias again. Finally, he stepped closer to the open window. "Mr. Brooks," he said carefully, his voice no longer carrying the sharp edge from earlier, but still holding authority. "Where exactly are you coming from tonight?" Elias Brooks answered without hesitation, his tone calm and even. "I am coming from the South Campus construction site on Jefferson Avenue," he said. "We finished a late inspection tonight." Officer Miller frowned slightly at the answer. Jefferson Avenue was several miles away on the far side of downtown, an area where cranes and steel frames had begun rising over the past year as the city expanded outward. The officer studied Elias again, trying to measure the truth in his words. "Late inspection," he repeated quietly. "What kind of work do you do, Mr. Brooks?" Elias rested one hand lightly on the steering wheel, while the other remained relaxed near the center console. "I work in development," he replied simply. Officer Miller tilted his head slightly. Development, he repeated again, his eyes narrowing just a little. That word could mean many things in a city that was constantly growing. Real estate investors, contractors, architects, and project managers all use that word. The officer looked down again at the registration still folded in his hand, and then slowly lifted his flashlight, once more allowing the beam to sweep briefly across the inside of the car. The interior revealed nothing suspicious, only quiet luxury polished wood panels, soft leather seats, and the faint scent of new upholstery. Elias Brooks sat patiently while the light moved across the cabin. There was no tension in his posture, no hurried explanations, and no attempt to rush the moment forward. The officer lowered the flashlight again. Something about the calm confidence in the driver expression unsettled him more than any argument would have. Most drivers became defensive during a traffic stop, especially when questioned. Elias Brooks had done the opposite. He had simply waited. Officer Miller glanced over his shoulder toward the skyline rising above the distant rooftops. Even from this quiet street, several tall construction cranes could be seen against the night sky, their red safety lights blinking slowly above the city. One particular tower on Jefferson Avenue had dominated the local news over the past year, a massive project that promised to reshape the business district once completed. The officer turned back toward Elias Brooks. Development, he said again slowly, as if testing the word for meaning. Are you a contractor working on one of those towers downtown? Elias Brooks allowed the smallest hint of a smile to appear before answering. Something like that, he said calmly. Officer Miller studied his face for another moment, realizing that the answer had not truly explained anything at all. In fact, the answer only deepened the quiet mystery forming around the man sitting inside the car. The officer looked once more at the registration in his hand, and then back at Elias Brooks, as a new thought slowly began to take shape in his mind, one that had not crossed his mind when the stop first began, and one that would soon force him to reconsider everything he believed about the man in front of him. Officer Grant Miller remained beside the open window, with a folded registration resting against his palm, while the silence of the street stretched longer than either man expected. The distant hum of a passing truck echoed from somewhere beyond the blocks of brick buildings, and the slow red glow of the construction cranes on the horizon pulsed against the dark sky. The officer followed Elias Brooks' gaze for a moment toward those lights before looking back again. Something about the way the man sat in the driver's seat still did not match the assumption that had formed the instant the patrol lights first flashed behind the car. Most drivers shifted in their seats during a stop. They asked questions. They explained themselves, quickly hoping to shorten the moment. Elias Brooks did none of those things. He simply waited as if the outcome of the conversation had already been decided long before the officer approached the car. Officer Miller cleared his throat and leaned slightly closer to the open window. Mr. Brooks, he said slowly, I'm going to ask you a few more questions. Elias nodded once in calm agreement. Go ahead, officer, he replied. The officer glanced down again at the registration in his hand, then back toward the calm face inside the car. That construction project on Jefferson Avenue, he said, the one with the tower rising near the river. Are you saying you were inspecting that building tonight? Elias Brooks answered without hesitation. Yes, I was. Officer Miller studied him carefully. That building is not a small project, he said. Elias gave a quiet nod. No, it is not. The officer shifted his weight again, feeling the earlier confidence of the stop continue to dissolve into something closer to uncertainty. Over the past year, that construction site had become one of the most talked about developments in the entire city. Local news stations had covered the groundbreaking ceremony months earlier when the mayor stood beside a group of investors promising new jobs and a transformed skyline. The project had been described as the largest private development the city had seen in decades. Officer Miller remembered watching a short interview about it during a late-night shift inside the patrol station. The broadcast showed computer images of glass towers rising above parks and office plazas. The announcer had spoken about billions of dollars in investment and a company that planned to reshape the downtown district. The officer blinked slowly as the memory returned. He had not paid much attention to the names involved in that project at the time. For him, it had simply been another news story playing in the background, while paperwork filled the night shift hours. Yet now standing beside this car, the memory felt strangely close. He glanced again toward the red, blinking lights of the cranes in the distance. Then he looked back at Elias Brooks. "You said you work in development," the officer said carefully. Elias nodded again. "That is correct." Officer Miller exhaled slowly while studying the man in front of him. The polished shoes, the tailored suit, the quiet patience, none of it carried the anxious energy the officer usually encountered during traffic stops. Instead, the calm presence of Elias Brooks seemed to make the entire moment feel smaller, as if the street itself had paused to watch what would happen next. The officer folded the registration again, but did not hand it back yet. "Development is a broad field," he said slowly. "Are you managing that project on Jefferson Avenue?" Elias Brooks allowed a small, thoughtful pause before answering. "You could say that I am involved in it," he replied calmly. Officer Miller frowned slightly at the careful wording. "Involve how?" he asked. Elias Brooks lifted his eyes briefly toward the skyline, where the distant cranes marked the location of the growing tower. Then he looked back at the officer with the same calm expression he had held from the beginning of the stop. "I suppose the simplest way to explain it," he said quietly, "is that the building would not exist without my company." The words hung in the air for a moment, carried only by the quiet engine vibration of the car and the distant rustle of wind through the empty street. Officer Miller felt something shift inside his chest as the meaning of the statement slowly settled in his mind. For the first time since the stop began, he realized that the man sitting in front of him might not simply be connected to the project at all. The possibility forming in his thoughts suggested something far more significant than he had imagined when the flashing lights first appeared behind the car. Officer Grant Miller did not respond immediately to the statement. That had just settled into the quiet night air. The flashing lights from the patrol car continued to sweep across the street, painting the polished surface of the black Rolls-Royce in slow waves of red and blue. For a few seconds, the officer simply stood beside the open window, holding the folded registration, while his eyes remained fixed on Elias Brooks. The calm expression on the driver's face had not changed. The engine of the car still hummed softly beneath the hood, and the distant sound of wind moving between the buildings filled the silence between them. The officer finally spoke again, though his voice carried less certainty than it had earlier in stop. "Your company," he repeated slowly. "What company would that be, Mr. Brooks?" Elias Brooks answered without raising his voice. "Brooks Urban Development," he said. The name seemed to settle into the night with surprising weight. Officer Miller blinked, once as if the words needed time to reach him. "Brooks Urban Development," he repeated quietly. The name was familiar, though he could not immediately place why. The officer shifted his stance and glanced once more toward the skyline, where the red safety lights of the cranes blinked above the growing tower on Jefferson Avenue. Over the past year, the city had watched that project rise piece by piece. News stations had described it as the largest redevelopment effort in decades. Entire blocks of abandoned warehouses were being replaced by glass towers, parks, and business centers. Thousands of jobs had been promised. Millions of square feet of office space were already under construction. And somewhere in the background of every report, the same company name had appeared. Brooks Urban Development. The officer looked back at the man sitting quietly behind the wheel. "Are you telling me you work for that company?" he asked. Elias Brooks gave a small nod. "I founded it," he replied calmly. The answer did not come with pride or irritation. It arrived with the same quiet steadiness that had marked every word he had spoken since the traffic stop began. Officer Miller felt a faint tightening in his chest. He searched Elias' face for some sign that the statement might be exaggerated or sarcastic, but there was none. The calm confidence remained exactly the same. The officer unfolded the registration, once more staring at the name printed across the top of the document. Elias Jonathan Brooks. For the first time since the flashing lights had appeared behind the car, the officer felt the weight of the moment begin to shift. He cleared his throat again, though the simple act now felt strangely awkward. "That project downtown," he said carefully. "The tower near the river." The officer hesitated as he realized the question forming in his mind sounded very different from the accusations that had started this encounter. "You're the one responsible for building that." Elias Brooks turned his head slightly toward the distant cranes that stood against the dark sky. Their red warning lights blinked slowly in the distance, marking the outline of the rising tower. When he spoke again, his voice carried the same calm tone it had from the beginning. "My company designed it, financed it, and manages the entire development," he said. The officer looked again toward the skyline, then back toward the driver's seat. For months, he had watched that tower grow during his night patrols. Steel beams had slowly climbed higher above the rooftops. New streets had been paved around the construction zone. Even the traffic patterns of the city had begun to change because of that project. And now the man responsible for that transformation sat quietly inside the car. He had stopped only minutes earlier because the scene had seemed suspicious. The realization did not arrive all at once. Instead, it moved through the officer mind piece by piece like the slow turning of a lock. He remembered the news broadcast describing the investors behind the development. He remembered the mayor praising the company during the groundbreaking ceremony. Yet he had never once imagined that the person who created the project might look like the calm man sitting in front of him tonight. Officer Miller slowly exhaled while the quiet street continued to hold its breath. The assumptions that had guided the beginning of this traffic stop were now beginning to unravel one by one. And for the first time since he stepped out of his patrol car, the officer realized that the situation unfolding in front of him was far different from the story he had expected to write when the flashing lights first appeared behind the black Rolls-Royce. Officer Grant Miller stood motionless for several seconds after hearing the calm explanation from Elias Brooks. The quiet street seemed different now. The flashing red and blue lights that had once felt like authority now reflected across the polished surface of a luxury car in a way that felt strangely out of place. The officer glanced again toward the skyline, where the distant tower cranes blinked above the dark outline of the city. For months he had driven past that construction zone during night patrol. Steel beams had slowly climbed higher week after week. Floodlights had illuminated the site through the night, while crews worked long hours preparing the foundation of what the city newspapers had called the future of downtown. Yet he had never once imagined that the person responsible for that transformation would be sitting calmly in the driver's seat of the car he had stopped only minutes earlier. Officer Miller looked back at Elias Brooks and felt the confidence he carried at the beginning of the stop continue to dissolve. The folded registration still rested in his hand. The name printed across the paper now carried far more weight than it had when he first read it under the flashlight beam. Elias Brooks watched the officer quietly without impatience. His posture remained relaxed, with one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel, while the other remained near the center console. The soft interior lights of the car illuminated the precise stitching of the leather seats and the quiet elegance of the cabin. Officer Miller cleared his throat again, though his voice sounded different when he spoke. "You founded Brooks Urban Development," he said slowly, as if confirming the reality of the statement. Elias nodded once. "Yes, I did." The officer shifted his stance beside the door of the car and glanced once more toward the skyline. "That tower on Jefferson Avenue," he said. "The glass one, rising near the river." Elias Brooks followed the direction of the officer's gaze toward the distant cranes. "Yes," he answered calmly. "That tower is the center of our new district project." The officer looked back at him. "I remember hearing about that on the news," he admitted quietly. "They said the project will create thousands of jobs when it is finished." Elias Brooks nodded again, though his expression remained thoughtful rather than proud. "That is the plan," he said. "When the district is complete, the area will include office towers, residential buildings, public parks, and a technology center. It will take several more years to finish everything." Officer Miller listened carefully as the explanation unfolded. Each word seemed to push the earlier assumptions further away from the moment they now stood inside. The officer slowly handed the registration back through the open window, but did not step away yet. Instead, he rested one hand lightly against the edge of the door while studying Elias Brooks' face. The calm composure of the driver no longer looked suspicious. Instead, it now looked like the quiet confidence of someone who carried responsibility for something much larger than the moment unfolding on this quiet street. The officer exhaled slowly as another realization began forming in his thoughts. He had stopped the car because the situation had appeared unusual to him. A luxury vehicle late at night. A driver who did not match the expectation he had built in his mind. Yet the more he listened, the more the story revealed itself in the opposite direction. "Mr. Brooks," the officer said after a moment of silence. "I have to admit something." Elias Brooks looked at him with patient curiosity. "When I saw the car earlier tonight," the officer continued, "I assumed something was wrong. I assumed the vehicle might not belong to the person driving it." The words hung in the night air for a brief moment. Elias Brooks did not react with anger or surprise. Instead, he gave a small, understanding nod, as if the statement simply confirmed something he had already known. Officer Miller looked down briefly at the pavement before lifting his eyes again. "It appears I was mistaken," he said quietly. Elias Brooks rested both hands lightly on the steering wheel while the faint glow of the dashboard lights reflected in his eyes. "Officer," he replied calmly, "you're not the first person to make that assumption, and you probably will not be the last." The honesty of the answer seemed to settle into the quiet street with surprising calm. The flashing patrol lights continued to sweep across the buildings, but now the moment felt very different from when the stop had first begun. Officer Miller stood beside the door of the car, realizing that the story unfolding in front of him was no longer about a suspicious vehicle at all. It had quietly become something else, entirely a lesson about how quickly a person can misjudge the truth when they believe they already know. The ending of the story. Officer Grant Miller remained beside the open window for a long, quiet moment after Elias Brooks finished speaking. The words, "You are not the first person to make that assumption," continued to echo in his thoughts with uncomfortable clarity. The flashing patrol lights still painted the pavement in restless color, but the authority those lights had carried earlier now felt strangely hollow. The officer looked down the empty street for a moment, as if hoping the night itself might offer some explanation that would restore the confidence he had walked up with only minutes earlier. A soft breeze moved through the avenue, carrying the distant scent of rain and river water from the direction of Jefferson Avenue. Officer Miller slowly lifted his eyes again toward the skyline, where the tall cranes stood blinking above the city like quiet witnesses. For months, those red lights had marked progress. Steel beams had climbed higher each week, while the news stations spoke about growth and opportunity. Now he understood that the man responsible for that transformation had been sitting quietly in front of him the entire time, while he questioned whether the car even belonged to him. The officer exhaled slowly and shifted his stance beside the door of the Rolls-Royce. "Mr. Brooks," he said carefully, his voice no longer sharp, but thoughtful, "I hope you understand that when we stop vehicles, we have to check things that seem unusual." Elias Brooks listened calmly before answering. "I understand, officer," he said. The calmness in his tone carried no resentment, and that somehow made the moment feel even heavier. Officer Miller glanced briefly at the polished hood of the car, where the red and blue reflections moved like waves across the black paint. When he first stepped out of the patrol car, he had seen the vehicle as a possible problem. Now it looked simply like a car waiting to continue its quiet drive through the city. The officer looked back at Elias again and hesitated before speaking. "I should probably ask one more question," he said. Elias gave a small nod, inviting him to continue. Officer Miller took a breath. "Why are you driving alone this late after leaving a project like that?" he asked. "I would expect someone responsible for a development that large to have security or a driver." Elias Brooks allowed a faint, thoughtful smile before answering. "I spend most of my days in meetings and offices," he said calmly. "Sometimes the quiet drive back through the city helps me remember why I started building in the first place." Officer Miller listened carefully. The answer felt genuine and surprisingly simple. The officer looked again toward the skyline, where the distant tower rose slowly above the rooftops. It occurred to him that while thousands of people talked about that project, every day very few of them had likely spoken directly with the person who created it. Yet here he was standing beside the door of a car, having stopped that very person because something about the scene had not matched the picture in his mind. The realization settled into his thoughts with uncomfortable honesty. Officer Miller finally stepped back from the car door, though he did not turn away yet. The flashing lights behind him continued to cast color across the street, but now they felt unnecessary. He reached toward his shoulder and pressed the small switch that controlled the emergency lights on the patrol vehicle. Instantly, the restless red and blue reflections disappeared, leaving the quiet street, lit only by the steady glow of the street lamps. The sudden calm seemed to change the entire atmosphere of the moment. The officer looked back toward Elias Brooks once more. "Mr. Brooks," he said slowly, "I appreciate your patience tonight." Elias Brooks gave a simple nod. "Patience is something you learn quickly when you build large things," he replied quietly. Officer Miller stood there for another brief moment, realizing that the stop, which began with suspicion, had slowly transformed into something much more reflective. What he had seen at the beginning of the encounter had been only a small part of the truth, and now that truth was becoming clearer with every passing second. On Jefferson Avenue continued their steady rhythm in the distance. For a moment, neither man spoke. The silence was no longer tense, but reflective, as if the city itself had slowed down long enough to observe what had just unfolded. Officer Miller glanced once more at the towering cranes, and then back at Elias Brooks, who still sat calmly behind the wheel. The officer realized something unexpected in that moment. The calmness he had first interpreted as suspicious now looked more like quiet confidence shaped by years of responsibility. "Mr. Brooks," the officer said slowly, "I imagine managing a project like that requires a great deal of pressure." Elias Brooks nodded slightly before answering. "Large projects always come with pressure," he said. "But pressure also creates opportunity." Officer Miller listened carefully. "What kind of opportunity?" he asked. Elias Brooks turned his head slightly toward the skyline again. "When I was young," he said, "I used to walk through the older parts of the city and see empty buildings, factories that had closed, and streets where businesses once stood but no longer existed. I remember thinking that cities should not fade like that. They should grow." The officer remained quiet, allowing the explanation to continue. Elias Brooks rested both hands lightly on the steering wheel as he spoke. "Development is not only about buildings," he continued. "It is about people. Every office tower means jobs for engineers, construction workers, electricians, and designers. Every apartment building means families moving into a neighborhood that once stood empty. Every park means children playing where there used to be nothing but concrete and dust." The calm conviction in his voice filled the quiet street. Officer Miller felt the words settle into his thoughts with surprising weight. He had driven patrol through this city for years. He had watched neighborhoods change slowly, block by block, without ever thinking much about the individuals responsible for those changes. Yet the man sitting in front of him had just described the city in a way the officer had never considered before. Elias Brooks paused for a moment before continuing. "That project on Jefferson Avenue," he said quietly, "will eventually create thousands of jobs and bring new businesses into the area. View from downtown streets." It was strange to realize that the person guiding that transformation had been sitting patiently in front of him during a traffic stop that began with suspicion. The officer slowly nodded. "That sounds like something the city could use," he admitted. Elias Brooks smiled faintly, though his tone remained thoughtful. "Cities are always changing," he said. "The question is whether we allow them to grow or whether we allow them to decay." The quiet conversation hung in the night air for several seconds. Officer Miller suddenly realized how different the encounter had become from the moment when he first approached the car with questions and assumptions. The man in front of him was no longer just the driver of a luxury vehicle. He was someone shaping the future of the very streets the officer patrolled every night. The realization carried an unexpected sense of humility. Officer Miller took a slow breath and looked once more at the skyline before returning his attention to Elias Brooks. "I have driven past that construction site many times during night patrol," he said. "I never imagined I would be speaking with the person responsible for it while standing on the side of the road." Elias Brooks gave a small, understanding nod. "Life has a way of creating unexpected meetings," he replied calmly. The officer allowed a faint smile to appear as the meaning of those words settled quietly between them while the city around them continued its slow, silent rhythm under the night sky. Officer Grant Miller remained beside the driver door for a moment longer while the quiet rhythm of the city continued around them. The night had settled into a calm silence that felt very different from the tense atmosphere that existed when the traffic stop first began. Without the flashing patrol lights, the street now looked ordinary again. The brick storefront stood quietly beneath the yellow glow of the street lamps, and the black Rolls-Royce rested at the curb, as if it had always belonged there. Officer Miller placed one hand lightly on the edge of the door and looked once more toward the skyline in the distance. The tower on Jefferson Avenue stood higher than the surrounding buildings, its steel frame rising toward the night sky where construction cranes blinked red warning lights above it. The officer had passed that site countless times during patrol, but tonight it carried a new meaning. He turned back toward Elias Brooks with a thoughtful expression. "Mr. Brooks," he said slowly, "I have to admit something else." Elias Brooks looked at him calmly. "Go ahead, officer," he replied. Officer Miller took a quiet breath before continuing. "When I first saw your car tonight, I thought I understood the situation before I even stepped out of my patrol vehicle. I thought I knew the story already." Elias Brooks listened without interrupting. The officer continued speaking with careful honesty. "I saw a luxury car late at night, and I saw the driver, and my mind filled in the rest of the details without waiting for the truth." The words seemed to hang in the night air for a moment. "Tonight, a technology center where young people from this city can learn new skills." The officer listened carefully. Elias continued speaking with the same calm, thoughtful tone. "The goal is to give people a chance to build something better for themselves without having to leave the city where they grew up." The quiet sincerity in his voice carried more weight than any public speech the officer had ever heard on the news. Officer Miller felt a subtle shift inside his chest. For years, he had driven patrol across the same neighborhoods, watching the city change in ways he rarely questioned. Streets improved or declined. Businesses opened or closed. Yet he had never once stopped to think about the people who imagined those changes long before they appeared in steel and glass. Elias Brooks rested his hand again on the steering wheel while the car idled patiently. "Officer," he said after a moment, "every building begins as an idea in someone's mind. But ideas only matter if they help people." Officer Miller nodded slowly. The words felt genuine, not rehearsed like a politician's speech, but simple and direct. "I suppose that tower will become part of the skyline for generations," he said quietly. Elias gave a small, thoughtful smile. "That is the hope," he replied. A light breeze moved along the street, carrying the distant sound of traffic from a nearby avenue. The quiet moment felt almost reflective now, as if both men understood that the encounter had become something larger than a routine stop. Officer Miller straightened slightly and gave a respectful nod. "Mr. Brooks, I appreciate you sharing that with me," he said. Elias Brooks returned the nod calmly. "Thank you for listening, officer." The car remained still for another second, while the engine hummed softly beneath the hood. Then Elias slowly eased his foot from the brake, and the Rolls-Royce began to move forward along the empty street. The polished black surface of the car glided beneath the street lamps, reflecting their warm light across the pavement. Officer Miller watched the vehicle roll quietly toward the intersection ahead. The sound of the engine faded gradually as the car continued its smooth, steady drive through the city. For a moment, the officer simply stood there in silence. The street felt unusually still now that the encounter had ended. He looked again toward the skyline where the tower on Jefferson Avenue stood rising against the night sky. Earlier that evening, he had seen only a suspicious car and a driver who did not match the expectations in his mind. Now, he saw something very different. A man who had quietly begun reshaping the future of the very city the officer had sworn to protect. The realization lingered as the Rolls-Royce disappeared around the corner, leaving the quiet street exactly as it had been before, yet somehow not the same at all. Officer Grant Miller remained standing in the quiet street long after the black Rolls-Royce disappeared around the corner. The soft sound of the engine had faded completely, now leaving only the distant murmur of late-night traffic drifting through the city. For a moment, the officer did not move. The street lamps cast long, quiet shadows across the pavement, and the patrol car sat behind him with its lights turned off, as if the vehicle itself understood that the urgency of the stop had passed. Officer Miller slowly placed his hands on his belt and looked down the road where the car had vanished. The encounter replayed in his mind piece by piece. Only minutes earlier, he had stepped out of his patrol vehicle with confidence, believing he understood exactly what he was dealing with. A luxury car late at night. A driver who did not match the expectation in his mind. He had believed the story was already clear before a single word had been spoken. Yet the truth had quietly unfolded in a completely different direction. The officer exhaled slowly and turned toward the skyline again. The tower on Jefferson Avenue stood tall above the city lights, its steel frame outlined against the dark sky. The blinking lights of the cranes marked the steady progress of a project that would change the future of the city. Earlier that night, it had simply been another construction site on his patrol route. Now it carried a very different meaning. Somewhere out there, the man responsible for that vision was driving home through the same streets the officer patrolled every night. The thought carried a quiet sense of humility. Officer Miller walked slowly back toward his patrol car and rested one hand against the roof for a moment before opening the door. The interior light flickered on revealing the radio unit and the stack of routine paperwork waiting. On the passenger seat, for a moment he did not sit down. Instead, he remained standing beside the open door while the cool night air drifted through the empty street. He realized something important had shifted in the way he would see the city from now on. Every car passing beneath the street lamps carried a story he did not yet know. Every driver behind the wheel carried experiences, responsibilities, and dreams that could not be guessed from a quick glance through a windshield. The assumptions he had made earlier now felt distant and incomplete. Officer Miller finally slid into the driver's seat of the patrol car and closed the door quietly. The soft sound echoed inside the empty vehicle. He placed both hands on the steering wheel and looked forward through the windshield toward the skyline once more. The tower on Jefferson Avenue still stood there, rising slowly toward completion. The officer imagined the offices, the homes, and the parks that would eventually surround it. He imagined families walking through those streets years from now, never knowing that the foundation of that future had once been shaped by a quiet man who simply wanted to build something better. The patrol radio crackled, softly breaking the silence inside the car. A dispatcher voice called out a routine update about traffic conditions several blocks away. Officer Miller reached toward the radio, but paused for a moment before responding. His mind still lingered on the lesson the evening had quietly delivered. Sometimes the most important part of a story was the part a person never expected to learn. The officer finally pressed the microphone button and acknowledged the dispatch message before starting the engine of the patrol car. As the vehicle pulled slowly away from the curb, he took one last glance toward the distant tower and allowed a thoughtful smile to cross his face. The city looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier, yet the way he saw it had changed forever. Officer Grant Miller guided the patrol car slowly through the quiet streets as the night continued to settle over the city. The soft hum of the engine and the steady rhythm of the tires moving across the pavement filled the silence inside the vehicle. The earlier traffic stop remained vivid in his thoughts. Every detail of the conversation replayed clearly in his mind, the calm voice of Elias Brooks, the quiet confidence in his posture, and the realization that had slowly replaced the assumptions the officer carried when the stop first began. The city outside the windshield looked familiar, yet somehow different now. Street lamps illuminated rows of buildings that had stood there for decades, and small restaurants on the corners were closing their doors for the night. Officer Miller had driven these streets countless times during patrol, but tonight he noticed details he had often overlooked. A family-owned grocery store with its lights still glowing through the front window. A construction crew packing tools into a truck at the edge of a renovation site. A young couple walking quietly along the sidewalk, talking beneath the street lamps. Each person he passed carried a story he could not see from behind the wheel of a patrol car. The officer slowed at an intersection and waited for the traffic light to change while the skyline of the city stretched across the distance ahead of him. The tower on Jefferson Avenue stood tall against the dark sky, its steel structure rising higher with each passing month. The blinking red lights of the cranes continued their steady rhythm, marking the slow but certain progress of the project. Officer Miller rested one hand on the steering wheel and allowed himself a thoughtful moment while he watched the skyline. The man responsible for that vision had not raised his voice during the encounter earlier that evening. He had not reacted with anger or frustration when questioned. Instead, he had simply allowed the truth to reveal itself step by step until the assumptions surrounding the situation quietly disappeared. The officer realized that patience required a different kind of strength and authority. The traffic light turned green and the patrol car moved forward again. As Officer Miller continued driving through the city, he began to understand the deeper meaning behind the conversation that had unfolded beside that quiet street earlier. Law enforcement was about more than enforcing rules or responding to suspicious situations. It also required understanding the community those rules were meant to protect. Every neighborhood carried its own history, and every person moving through the city carried experiences that shaped the path they walked. Judging too quickly could cause someone to overlook the truth standing directly in front of them. The officer turned onto a wider avenue where the lights of downtown reflected softly across the windows of office buildings. Some of those buildings had stood for generations, while others were new additions to the skyline. Soon the district on Jefferson Avenue would join them, bringing a new chapter to the story of the city. Officer Miller imagined the day when that tower would be complete, when workers would fill the offices and families would walk through the parks that would surround it. He imagined children playing in open green spaces where empty lots once stood, and young professionals starting careers in technology centers that did not yet exist. All of that future had begun with an idea carried by a man who had remained calm during a simple traffic stop on a quiet street. The patrol radio crackled again with a routine message from dispatch updating officers about traffic conditions near the river. Officer Miller acknowledged the message and continued along his patrol route. Yet the city felt different now, not because the buildings had changed, but because the way he saw them had grown more thoughtful. Sometimes the most important lessons arrived during moments that seemed ordinary at first. A traffic stop, a conversation, a realization that truth could not be measured by assumptions alone. As the patrol car moved through the quiet streets, Officer Miller understood that the lesson from that encounter would remain with him far beyond this single night. The city began to quiet as the night moved slowly toward early morning. Street lamps cast long, gentle pools of light across the pavement, while the distant hum of traffic softened into a steady background rhythm. Officer Grant Miller continued driving along his patrol route, but the earlier encounter remained clear in his mind. The calm voice of Elias Brooks and the quiet confidence in his words had stayed with him through every street he passed. The realization that assumptions could hide the truth had settled deeply within him. Across the city, the black Rolls-Royce moved through the final miles of Elias Brooks' drive home. The car glided smoothly through the wide avenue, leading toward the northern hills where the lights of residential neighborhoods rested against the dark outline of the trees. Elias drove in silence for several minutes, reflecting on the encounter that had unfolded earlier that night. Situations like that were not unfamiliar to him. Over the years, he had learned that patience often revealed more than anger ever could. The city outside his window was the same city he had grown up in, though much of it had changed. Old factories had become new businesses. Empty lots had slowly transformed into neighborhoods filled with homes and parks. The project on Jefferson Avenue was only the next chapter in that long story of change. Elias turned onto a quiet road lined with tall maple trees and finally guided the car into the driveway of a modest modern home overlooking the city. From the hill, the skyline stretched across the horizon, and the tower rising on Jefferson Avenue could still be seen standing above the rest of the buildings. Elias stepped out of the car and paused for a moment beside the door. The cool night air carried the distant sounds of the city below. From this height, the streets looked calm and peaceful. It was the same city where he had once walked past abandoned warehouses and empty blocks, imagining what they could become. Now many of those places had begun to transform into something new. Back in the patrol car, Officer Miller slowed near the river where the lights of the construction site on Jefferson Avenue illuminated the steel framework of the tower. The structure looked enormous from street level. Floodlights bathed the rising beams in bright white light, while construction cranes stood silently above the site waiting for the next day of work. The officer parked the patrol car briefly along the curb and stepped outside. The quiet sound of the river moved through the night air as he looked up at the tower. Somewhere above those steel beams, the future skyline of the city was slowly taking shape. Officer Miller realized that earlier that night, he had nearly dismissed the man responsible for that vision based on nothing more than a quick assumption. The thought carried a lasting lesson. Cities were built not only with steel and glass, but with patience, ideas, and determination. He stood there for a moment longer before returning to the patrol car. High above the city, Elias Brooks remained on the hill overlooking the skyline. The tower lights blinked steadily in the distance, marking the place where thousands of people would soon work live and build their own futures. Elias allowed himself a quiet smile before turning toward his home. The city below continued its slow rhythm, moving toward another day of work and opportunity. Somewhere on those streets, Officer Miller resumed his patrol, carrying with him a deeper understanding of the community he served. The night had begun with suspicion, but it ended with clarity. And in the quiet space between those moments, two men had learned something important about the power of patience and the danger of judging a story before it had the chance to reveal its truth.